This video is brought to you by Schmendrick Hate Club. Use code SCHMENDICK666 for 10% off all merchandising and products. Enjoy the video. The dichotomy and interconnectedness of power and belief is a relationship that the genre of fantasy is very familiar with. Since there are so many possibilities with magic systems, powers, humans, creatures, unknowable beings, it kind of just lends itself to exploring these concepts in really interesting and creative ways. You can have an omnipotent god, but if he has no followers, then they're basically just some guy. Because what is a god without religion? That's like your high school basketball team if only their parents showed up to their games. That's like Zendaya if she stopped with Shake It Up. That's like me making video essays. Now on the other side of the spectrum are just normal humans, low power, but then once they hit the battlefield, they start tearing it up because they got like self-confidence or the power of friendship. I don't know. Sharing this same ratio of high belief to low power are characters that use their faith in magic, higher powers or whatever to just get through day-to-day life or deal with traumatic or stressful situations. Just like religion, except cool, because there's fairies and dragons. Now on another part of the spectrum, which is basically just a circle now, you have capital G gods. Ultra powerful, they have followers, everyone knows they're the shit, pretty unstoppable. These guys, kind of boring, not gonna lie. They work better as either end goals, earning whatever happiness or stability that they have with their power and belief after hardships and development, or as starting points and then they get broken down and their worldview gets shaken up. Satisfaction from a story can come from watching a character go from one part of the spectrum to another. Wait, not a spectrum. Hold on. I made a chart. Where do you fit on the chart? If you say anything other than quadrant 3, you're actually quadrant 4, and I hope those delusions are working out for you. They have not for me. The way that my brain likes to interpret this is by analyzing different circumstances of belief in power and characters' reactions to them. So I'll be framing my analysis around characters from Mark Spielmacher's Engel 208A course material. Not all of them, because that'd be too much, just my favorites and the ones that use these concepts the most. So, how does fantasy literature examine these topics, and how varied can their interpretations get? What messages can readers derive from these themes? How do they elevate the text? Is this messaging important? Does it make good art? What is good art? Who am I to say what good art is? Am I placing myself in quadrant 4 by making this video? Omnipotent gods. High power, high belief. They tend to be kind of boring and very OP. They don't make incredibly compelling protagonists because they just don't have problems, and they're hard to write as side characters because if they're so powerful, then why haven't they just solved the problem? That's like when Martin Scorsese voiced a shark mob boss in an animated DreamWorks film. What? Why did he do that? In terms of main characters, this is typically used as either a starting point and then some inciting conflict pushes them into another quadrant, and that's how we spend most of our time with the character, or it's an end point after they have spent their journey earning their omnipotence. Dream from Neil Gaiman's The Sandman works his way into this quadrant during the first book of his comics, issues 1 to 8, but he really comes into his power during this introductory arc. By the end of it, he's fully worked his way back to the throne and overcome both loss of belief and power, which we'll get more into later on. Once he's in his strongest state, conflicts aren't written around him. Instead, they'll occur and then he runs in to fix them, you know, basic hero stuff. His issues then come from moral dilemmas, questioning his purpose and responsibility as one of the endless. He progressively connects more with humans, which he calls the waking, because they're awake. Such a creative little man. So this interaction between a being who's literally described as more powerful than a god and just regular old humans directly addresses the difference in perspective that this creates and humanizes Dream to the readers. It is so empowering to see Dream overcoming very human issues like depression and loss, specifically by watching humans overcome the same issues. If he can have a bad day and move on from it, then so can I. These comics do a great job at direct discourse on power and belief while using it to encourage self-confidence in the reader. Now, there are a couple other uses for this dynamic in secondary characters and antagonists, but only with certain plot restrictions or rules to the world or magic system. A good example of this is Gandalf from Tolkien's works, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. He's an ultra-powerful wizard Giga Chad who absolutely mucks up any enemy he faces, and you know my guy would be committing mass genocide and terraforming Middle-earth if he had free reign. Unfortunately, man's got morals and some strange restrictions on his usefulness. The reason why The Hobbit doesn't just end where it starts is because Gandalf really just doesn't care. This is just a strange weekend to him. He's just helping out some halflings that he likes, you know? In the immortal words of Loki, god of mischief,
an ant has no quarrel with a boot.
He's just vibing with the dwarves and Bilbo while he's in town, you know? The reason why he isn't the villain in these stories is because he's just a good guy. He's just a friendly man with a big heart for little people with big feet. If Gandalf weren't moral, he'd be like Sauron. Unironically, factually, they are the same being, just with different motives. Gandalf is moral, Saruman is amoral, and Sauron is immoral. It doesn't take a microscope to see this. Speaking of villains, Sauron, Smaug, Thanos, the Red Bull, not that Red Bull, the one from The Last Unicorn. Big bads that serve as vessels and foils for interpersonal conflicts, and catalysts that force the protagonist into action. Endgame boss villains that represent the struggles that the protagonist overcomes throughout their journey more than individuals with personal struggles and conflicts and things like that. The Red Bull is a violent manifestation of the unicorn's fear of being forgotten and just disappearing. She feels as if her existence relies on her being perceived and remembered, and her environment reflects this. Humans and other non-magical creatures don't recognize her as a unicorn, as her authentic self, so she might as well just not exist at all. This terrifies her and makes her feel helplessly alone. It's why she leaves the safety of her home in the first place. The Red Bull, of course, is not the main antagonist of this book, and I'm talking about Schmendrick the Magician. Fuck Schmendrick. All my homies hate Schmendrick. Selfish little prick. Just enjoy immortality and be mediocre for eternity. Why you gotta be out here making this poor unicorn's worst fear come true? Schmendrick is the real villain of The Last Unicorn and you're all too blind to see it. And then there's King Haggard, I guess, who represents apathy, loss of hope and belief, everything that threatens the unicorn's existence in the world, and also the literal force that drove them out of the world. He's a disillusioned old man who's lost all hope in the world after spending multiple human lifetimes in it. His tyranny is born out of a difficulty experiencing pleasure and joy. He consumes and destroys out of a need to fill whatever feels like is perpetually missing from him, always wanting, never satiated. His consumption of resources and magic spreads his misery and cynicism across the world, replacing any sort of belief or realism in magical creatures like the unicorn. King Haggard has taken all of the world's belief in magic and repurposed it in the form of fear and despair. His corrupting oppression of nature and magic is what gives him power. He demands control of the world, and with the help of his minion, the Red Bull, he achieves it. High power as a direct result of high belief, which then feed into each other as time goes on. Now back to Schmendrick. Thought I was done with him? Nah, here's why he's the villain of The Last Unicorn. Sure, he has a full heroic arc and his actions and intentions align with the unicorns for the majority of the novel, but there's one integral scene that solidifies his villainy in my eyes. The scene I'm referring to happens in Chapter 8 when the Red Bull is chasing after the unicorn and she's about to get captured or killed or some other undesirable outcome. So Molly tells Schmendrick to use his magic to protect her. Schmendrick is hesitant since he's not a very proficient magician and is messed up in the past, so he's afraid of failing and doesn't see any point of trying. Molly soon convinces him to cast something in the heat of the moment, a desperate attempt to save his friend, a passionate attempt at proving his worth, a reckless attempt to manifest the power that his mentor promised he'd find. His decision in the scene so explicitly enforces the unicorn's fear in favor of his own ego and selfish desires. She told him right when they met that she would literally rather get taken by the bull than turn into a human and lose her identity. And Schmendrick just completely disregards this. He could have attempted any other spell, any other outcome. He could have tried teleporting her, capturing the bull, giving her a cool hat or something. I don't know. Just Schmendrick. This was the worst option. fun! So the reason Schmendrick decides to make this buttfuck of a choice is because in his mind, the pinnacle of magic use is turning a unicorn into a human. Specifically, he says this in chapter 4 in the same conversation that the unicorn states that this is her worst nightmare. When Schmendrick uses magic, he sees himself as a vessel for the power he's wielding. He isn't in control of it, he just possesses the ability to call upon it and channel it into whatever desired task he wants done. Since he isn't a good magician, he can't control it very well, and since he knows this, his commands are almost always marred with the bias of his ego, however big or small, usually small. So Schmendrick's thought process in this moment, as I understand it, starts with his rationalization that this super powerful Red Bull will require a super powerful spell to stop. Sounds reasonable, right? Here's why it's not, okay? It's proven in Mommy Fortuna's Night Carnival that it does not take strong magic to temporarily overpower creatures with larger amounts of power. If his goal for this encounter was to form a temporary solution, then the base amounts of magic will do just fine. But that's not what he's thinking. He's thinking, I need power. What's the most powerful spell that I know? You guessed it, transformation from specifically unicorn to human, for some fucking reason. So his train of thought has led him to the spell, which leads naturally to his own self-worth, and now this is his chance to prove it. He's convinced himself that the only way to save his friend is by turning her into a human, completely disregarding her desires and fears in the situation, reasoning that she'll be grateful in the end since she'd be dead otherwise. So instead of viewing this as a selfish, reckless decision that prioritizes his own desire for power in his friend's identity or fear of losing it, he sees it as a last resort that's perfectly suited to his personal agenda. How convenient for you, Schmendrick. How convenient. To me, it changes who I am fundamentally. I might be safer and more secure, but I wouldn't be me. I'd have essentially been killed, and Amalthea's reaction to her own existence reflects this perspective. She's devastated, saying repeatedly, I will die here. A promise, a realization, a prediction. I call Schmendrick the villain of The Last Unicorn because he causes the worst fear, devastation, and anxiety that the unicorn has ever experienced. If that's not villain behavior, I don't know what is. To tie this all in, since I kind of went on an anti-Schmendrick rant for a minute there, the spell has high power, high belief, negative empathy, and 0 brains. What, did you think I was going to go in order with these? Try to predict me. I'm like a tornado. Wait, those are actually really easy to predict. I'm like those dome poppy things you used to get in parties as a kid. I'm like the Weird Al biopic in which Madonna becomes a drug lord at a pure circumstance. I'm like a woman's menstrual cycle. Wait. Quadrant 3, low power, low belief, friendly little guys that don't have much going on for them. They actually make pretty compelling protagonists for the majority of the hero's journey, or the monomyth, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Insert diagram here, if I do my editing correctly. They tend to be just normal humans, relatable, voice of reason type characters. Some good examples of this is Bilbo from The Hobbit, or any of the other hobbits from the Lord of the Rings series at the beginning of their journey. Before any character development or anything. Another example of this would be children, young children under the age of 10. They tend to just be written as children. Teens and preteens are given an unprecedented amount of power for their age, specifically in YA novels like Twilight and Percy Jackson and Harry Potter. We didn't see a lot of these characters in the material we covered in this course, mostly because they're not as nuanced and they don't offer as many creative possibilities as the other 2 quadrants we'll be talking about later on. That's not to say that characters written in this quadrant are bad, that it's a really good foundation for building a complex character development around. It's just limiting creatively to only look at this quadrant. We saw this character most in short stories in which the characters were more vessels for either the plot of the story, the world, or the themes of the text. When written well, they can be incredibly compelling and just as nuanced as some of the other characters that we looked at and will be looking at later in this video. This character is just a blank slate and can be kind of an outcast in the fantasy genre, with traits that can be great strengths that are also creatively limiting. It takes more effort to create the complexities that would be easy to introduce in a character's backstory or lore. It's easier to establish a character this way instead of building them from the ground up the way that Tolkien did with Bilbo. The Hobbit follows the hero's journey pretty closely. Now, Tolkien didn't use it as a template since The Hobbit was published before Joseph Campbell even created the term, but he did draw inspiration from the same myths and tales that Campbell's work references. Characters in this quadrant tend to fit into the hero's journey because they start in just the normal world, average, predictable, and then develop and change as the circumstances of the new world that they're thrust into create different conflicts and problems for them. Using Bilbo as an example,
Dildo Baggins.
He starts with no special abilities or powers and no desire for these things, and then after being thrown into this adventure by Gandalf, he gains confidence and XP. This man really spent his entire life in his little hobbit hole in the Shire, and then just one day up and leaves for like half a year and comes back leveled up with a kill count and magical items to spare. Imagine you're Frodo in this scenario. Like, imagine that's your uncle. Like, Bilbo. You're not even employed. What are you doing with the single most powerful and evil item in this realm? So this is a pretty clear-cut standard use for this power belief dynamic in a character. Start low on both and then increase them as the character develops. It makes for an easily relatable character with a natural progression to follow. So there are two other characters that end up in this quadrant at some point in their journeys, and they are Amalthea and Dream of the Endless. These characters both end up losing their abilities and faith in themselves, as well as any faculty that they held as once ruling forces in their respective planes. As aforementioned, Amalthea gets turned into a human by my worst enemy, Schmendrick the Magician. She loses her magic and identity and then eventually completely forgets herself. The unicorn believes that if she isn't believed in or perceived, then she might as well not even exist. She also believes that she needs to exist in her own memory to exist physically, and vice versa. If she forgets herself, then she can't exist, and if she doesn't exist physically, then she forgets herself. She becomes lost, becomes human. Now, Amalthea isn't entirely powerless. She still has that ethereal aura around her and is generally unicorn-like in terms of vibes and how her presence affects the people around her. Not at all to the extent that her true form has, and she couldn't perform any magic that the unicorn could. The only remnants left of the unicorn are the memories that exist in her friends' minds and the mark on her forehead where her horn should be. Narratively, she finds herself in this quadrant of my chart to raise the stakes for the characters and get them close to the main antagonist. It serves as a perfect opportunity to explore her fears directly, gives Schmendrick and Molly the clear objective of turning Amalthea back into a unicorn, creates more opportunities to explore the importance of the unicorn's identity versus her newfound life and love as Amalthea, and puts them in the perfect place for developing King Haggard. Dream of the Endless is put in a similar position for narrative reasons comparable to both Amalthea and Bilbo. The part of the Sandman text that I'm referring to is right at the beginning in issue 1, where he's been locked in a glass orb of some sort and all of his tools were taken from him. He eventually finds a moment of weakness in his captors and is able to escape while enacting revenge, but not before his kingdom is left completely run down and his tools are scattered. He's left with no followers and extremely limited powers. This is similar to Amalthea's story because it breaks the characters down to their base fears, and it gives them opportunities to address these themes directly and establish the stakes for the protagonist. We know exactly what Dream wants and doesn't want, and he's being forced into acting on those needs. It compares to Bilbo in the way that it introduces the character from a moldable foundation. Dream's powers get introduced with his tools as he regains them. The struggles that Dream goes through to regain his power and belief develop his character naturally while letting the readers connect with him as they're getting taken along for the ride. Chapter 2. I've already touched on most of what I want to talk about in this video, so I'll just mention when these characters are in these quadrants and I won't go in depth again. We basically covered all of the, broad strokes, general idea, surface level, and a little bit deeper of the characters that I want to focus on, Amalthea and Dream. So now I'm going to get into some more specifics with their characters, starting with Amalthea. Amalthea is introduced in this quadrant, high power, low belief, because as a unicorn, she is a creature with lots of power, and this is established in the story as just humans, how they talk about her, how she's introduced by the narrator, how she is treated by Mommy Fortuna and Schmendrick and other creatures and characters around the carnival. So it's established that she has power, and it's established that she isn't believed in. Characters don't believe that she's a unicorn, don't recognize that she has magic, they don't see her power, and they don't see her value as a unicorn. They think that she's just a white horse. So this is the conflict that drives her to leave the safety of her home. It's what starts the entire story. She doesn't feel the belief from her world, and so she feels like she just doesn't exist to them. And so she goes to find the other unicorns that supposedly have disappeared, and that's why no one believes in unicorns anymore, because they kind of don't exist. They don't exist except for her, so it feels like they don't exist at all. This power to belief dynamic is what kind of gets the unicorn's fear in her head. It introduces the idea of not being believed and not existing. So once she loses her powers and becomes Amalthea, that's when like her biggest fear comes true. It's the actualization of the fear that she realizes once she realizes that she isn't being perceived by the world that she lives in. Her realizing that the lack of other unicorns around and lack of belief in unicorns exists in the world around her bolsters her fear of straight up not existing, which will then happen later. Introducing the unicorn in this quadrant with high power, low belief introduces her fear of not existing while also introducing her character. So if she were introduced with no power as well, then we wouldn't have spent any time with the character before experiencing this fear. So her turning into Amalthea just wouldn't hold the same power to us as readers, and it would have a different purpose as a text. There's not much more I can say on the unicorn without just reiterating what I said before. Analyzing her through those lenses just inevitably included the other parts of her character for context. Dream from the Sandman comics fits into this quadrant at the end of the first book in issue 8, where he has regained all of his power, he's got his kingdom back, he's back in the swing of things, but he just doesn't feel right. He doesn't feel safe with his power, he doesn't feel secure in his status anymore. And he spends the issue trying to figure out why that is. Dream's insecurity and discomfort in this issue actually comes from him basically experiencing the fear of death for the first time in his existence. It was never something that he had to fear before, it was never something that was threatening to him until he lost his powers and until he had to face someone who was using and abusing his powers against Dream. So Dr. D, while using Dream's amulet, tries to kill Dream in his realm of dreams. I'm saying dreams so often, but it's used a lot. I swear it's not me. So Dr. D tries to kill Dream, but instead of killing Dream, he accidentally blows up the amulet that is housing the powers that he's using. Dr. D basically defeated himself through arrogance and idiocy, thinking that he could control these powers when he actually knew nothing about what they could do. So in the last issue of book 1, issue 8, The Sound of Her Wings, Dream talks with his sister, Death, and just walks with her through the city as she takes the lives of different humans. Through these experiences, he is reminded of how gentle she is. He's reminded of how normal and natural death is. He's reminded that it's not something that he needs to fear. He's reminded of his belief that death is not the end. So before he overcomes this fear, he feels completely lost with himself. He has all of his powers back, so high power, but no self-assurance and no self-confidence and no way of feeling secure with himself because of the experience that he had, because of the trauma that he faced, because he was afraid of experiencing death for the first time in his life. This is a really important place to see this character in because, as I said before, these comics do a really good job at placing Dream into relatable situations so that it's empowering to watch him overcome them, and it's empowering to relate to this character. Because he's such a powerful being, knowing that he goes through the same struggles as you is just, it creates such a strong connection with the reader, and it gives such a powerful message. The message that you are not alone. There are other people who have these experiences and these feelings, and they're able to overcome it, and so can you. You're welcome. The last one actually matches the part of the video that it's in. This quadrant is reserved for the sweetest of babies who deserve the world. They have lots of belief but no powers of their own. Characters like Molly Grew from The Last Unicorn and from the book Among Others. The character Moore, the main character, they belong in this quadrant where they believe in powers, they believe in higher purpose, they believe in magical beings and creatures, but they don't have any powers themselves. Well, it depends on how you look at it in Moore's case. In Moore's case, she does believe that she has the powers. In the case of Molly Grew from The Last Unicorn, she just believes in higher powers, specifically the unicorn, and believes in all of like magical creatures that have been forgotten in the world, and uses them as just motivation for getting through the day, and it's real sweet. And then when she finally meets the unicorn, it's like, oh hell yeah, everything is validated now. Everything that I've been living for, everything that I've been waiting for. It's like if a Christian died and saw God and went to heaven. That's what Molly Grew was experiencing when she saw the unicorn. Or it's like when Moses parted the sea or whatever. I don't know. I just watched Prince of Egypt. I don't know religious lore. It's like meeting a celebrity crush that you've had for years. It's like if I met Dodie. Bro, I love Dodie. That'd be like if the Avengers were real. Bro, if the Avengers were real and I met like Captain America or I saw Thor flying through the air, damn, that'd be a transcendent experience. That's what this is. It's a transcendent experience. It's a validation of your beliefs. It's something I'm never gonna experience. Mostly because I have dipshit beliefs like Marvel and Dodie. Anyways, Molly Grew, my baby girl. She's so sweet. I'm so sorry. Another character that fits into the sweetheart category, as I am so lovingly naming it, is Moore from Among Others. It can be argued that she fits into the first quadrant with power and belief, but I am choosing to analyze this from the perspective that she is actually just hallucinating, because it works for my video. Part 1 is long enough. That's the only reason. Sweet little Moore has experienced trauma, and so she uses fairies and powers as ways to cope with that trauma, ways to make her feel powerful, ways to make her feel loved, dealing with loneliness after losing her twins, so it feels like she's lost a part of herself, and she's replacing it with visions of fairies and things like that, and believing that she actually has powers, which I think is just the same as like religious people believing in miracles and seeing, you know, small things as miracles. It's kind of a beautiful thing where just small things will happen in your life, just coincidences that are really positive and affect you and the people around you in kind of incredible ways. And then just seeing that as an act of God or an act of yourself in Moore's perspective, where she believes that she's causing these little coincidences that make her life easier. It's just a beautiful little way to interpret the world around you, and it's an example of having lots of belief and no power. In Moore's case, she has this belief because she doesn't have a lot of power, and she's afraid of losing control and autonomy of herself because of how she's being treated by her mother. Dream also fits in this category for a brief amount of time when he has escaped from his prison orb, but he hasn't regained his powers yet. So at this point, he still has a lot of confidence in himself in being able to retrieve them. He's kind of humbled in the sense that he knows what order he's going to retrieve them in, but at this point he has absolutely no doubt that he will retrieve them. He just needs to do it in the right order. He knows he's not powerful enough to go straight to hell and fight demons for it, but he has no doubt that once he has gotten one from the humans, which he knows will be easier, he has no doubt that with that power he'll be able to get the next one, and then with that be able to get the next one, which he has to find also. He didn't know where the other one was. Dream kind of has a different purpose in this quadrant than the other two characters that I talked about. Instead of it bolstering his confidence through just mundane, average, normal life, it's really just arrogance for him. Less of a religious belief, less of faith, and less using it as coping, and more just overconfidence and arrogance, where he thinks that he has more power than he does because he's not used to having this amount of power. He's always had more power. This only becomes a detriment when he faces Dr. D, and as I said before, he almost dies. So him going into that fight expecting to win easily is just him being overconfident, having more belief in himself than power he actually has. He's just overestimating his abilities at this point. Compared to Molly and Moore, who, well, Molly knows that she doesn't have power, and Moore is using her belief not as just confidence and overestimating herself, but as a necessary way to view her world in order to handle traumatic experiences. If she didn't have this way to cope, then she might just have another healthy way to cope. She might just pour herself into her writing in the way that she uses her diary, or she might just not be able to handle it. And I guess having these visions is her way of not being able to handle it. Yeah, that seems more accurate. That seems more accurate. This oversaturated belief in herself and in fairies and other beings is just her not being able to handle the experiences that she had and recontextualizing them in a way that is friendlier to her, in a way that she can deal with on her own, because she does feel incredibly alone and there's no one that she can really go to solve this. The light changed in that scene, did you notice? This interpretation of faith in fantasy serves different purposes, but ultimately important ones for all different types of readers. For religious readers, it's easy to relate to these characters and to connect to those feelings that they have. And for non-religious readers, it's good to just have these ideas and perspectives in the stories without needing to mar them with whatever biases that actual religions have or will cause in the reader. So here's just a little visual representation of our chart and the characters in it. Don't be confused by Moore. I just used a photo of Prilla from the Tinkerbell series that I grew up reading as a kid. I just thought that the character fit well enough, and there are no visual representations of Moore, so this is the closest I could get. As you can see, Dream is in all of the categories. He's a pretty diverse character in terms of where he stands with belief and power. That's a pretty integral part of his character and the themes that his texts explore. Same with the Unicorn and Amalthea. She's in 3 out of 4 of them. I separated them into different characters because they're different characters to me. And then you've got Bilbo and Gandalf on opposite sides of the chart, and we've also got Molly Gruen here. I think that's everyone that we discussed, and if you're wondering why Schmendrick isn't in here, it's because he doesn't deserve to show his face anymore, that it's already been shown. And that's it for the chart. Thank you. So, reiterating the 4 quadrants, we have super powerful people, and everyone knows it, they're chillin'. We have basic people, not powerful, everyone knows it, also chillin'. Powerful people with no belief either in themselves or external validation, so they basically can't use their powers, or their powers just aren't enough for internal security, validation, or whatever conflict is going on there. And quadrant 4 were basically religious people who use magic and the notion of other powers and higher entities or creatures as a way to either cope with traumatic experiences or just to get through day-to-day life. Thank you very much for watching and making it to the end of this video. I'm very sorry for everything that I said here, but I hope that you learned something about the text that I analyzed. I hope that you learned something about the concepts that I was using as a lens to interpret them through. And I hope that you came up with critiques of your own on both my work and the work that I was discussing. So, thank you again, and have a good day.